Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of CESA, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, our members, clients, and other interested viewers. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, the purpose of which is to launch the CESA Best Practice Procurement of Consulting Engineering Services Manual. It's also known as the PCES Manual 2023. And it's being introduced to CESA members as well as their client bodies. I will be your moderator for this webinar. My name is Wally Main. I'm a civil engineer occupying the position of Contractual Affairs Manager at CESA. I'd like to inform you that the webinar is being recorded and that the presentations will be available on the CESA website after the webinar under the YouTube icon, and the link will also be forwarded to delegates. Just some housekeeping. On the taskbar at the bottom of the screen, you will see the chat and the Q&A icons. Please use the chat for any comments you may have and the Q&A for your questions, which will be addressed in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, at the end of the presentations. If you pose a question, kindly indicate which presenter you'd like to answer the question. So thank you for that. Called the Best Practices PCES Manual 2023. The manual is an extensive revision and update of the earlier 2011 and 2013 CESA guidelines for the procurement of consulting engineering services. It's the third edition of the PCES manual, and it provides guidance for both public and private sector clients on best practices in the procurement of consulting engineering services. It's important to note that the manual incorporates the gate approval process taken from National Treasury's framework for infrastructure development and procurement management, the FIDPM. So we're in line with legislation. Included in the manual is an overview of the pro forma model. It's a template for proposals, the request for proposals, the RFP, or tender document. A PDF version of the manual is freely available on the CESA website. That link will be available in the chat section on your screen, but an easy way to find the manual is to go to the CESA website at cesa.co.za to click on guidelines, then click on guidelines and procedures, and hey presto, you will see the document in front of you. In addition, an MS Word version of the request for proposals, or the RFP template, which is in part 2 of the manual, will be available from CESA. So you just simply have to email your request to important address. Just email your request to general@cesa.co.za. The pro forma and template this pro forma and template, the MS Word version, will enable clients and their consulting engineers to prepare tender documentation for their contracts or projects. And in a few weeks, the printed version of the manual will be available as a handy reference document, and that will be for purchase from the CESA bookstore. Just a few words regarding the importance of the manual and its potential role in facilitating successful infrastructure delivery in South Africa. Infrastructure development has been identified by government and our president, Mr. Ramaphosa, as one of the most important mechanisms for achieving job creation and economic growth in our country. So critically important to successful infrastructure development is the employment of professional service providers and construction contractors who are able to deliver functional infrastructure as envisaged and intended by the client. The process starts with the procurement of a professional services provider, such as a consulting engineer, who will firstly design and monitor the construction of the infrastructure, and secondly, guide and support the client through the entire infrastructure delivery process, from the first identification of the project all the way through to commissioning and operation of the project, And in this process, the PCES manual plays a vital role when procuring the services of a consulting engineer by, amongst other things, providing guidance as to the latest best practice standards, as well as providing a template for the compilation of an RFP or tender document. This webinar will be jointly presented by 3 authors or the developers of the updated manual. And in order to save time, they will present interchangeably as they run through the manual. And then after their presentations, they will collectively answer the questions. The presenters in no particular order are Francis Gibbons, Dave Clark, and Craig Clark, who are all professional engineers. They have a wealth of consulting engineering experience, and they are active members of the CESA Supply Chain Management Committee, which committee has overseen the production of the manual. We trust that you will find this webinar and the introduction to the best practice PCES Manual 2023 to be both informative and, importantly, enjoyable. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Francis Gibbons, who will be the first of the presenters to kick off the presentations. Francis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wally, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. It is indeed a privilege for us to present this document on behalf of CESA to you. As Wally mentioned, the 3 of us will be presenting jointly, so we'll be passing the speakership over between slides to each other, and so we hope it will go smoothly. I'd like to start off with the program, which basically follows the structure of the PCES manual. So it starts with the consulting engineer's role in the infrastructure lifecycle. We then go on to the constitution and legal environment surrounding the procurement of government supplies and services. Then touch on procurement practice in South Africa with regard to consulting engineers. We then start on the procurement process. It's the procurement of professional services following FITPIM, Framework for Infrastructure Development and Procurement Management, and then on to how the process for preparing the procurement document. Craig will talk to the pro forma RFP document that is part 2 of the manual that Wally has mentioned. And Dave will talk about evaluation of tenders and risk assessment and the administering of professional services contracts. So without further ado, I'd like to go into this slide. So as mentioned, the process followed in the PCES manual is aligned with the National Treasury Framework for Infrastructure Development and Procurement Management, which was published in Instruction Note 3 of 2019-2020, and the local government equivalent, which was published under MFMA Circular 106 of 1st of October. The processes are shown in the form of flowcharts showing the description and deliverables for each of the gates, and where approval is to be obtained before going on to the next stage. So that's the key aspect of the infrastructure development management system process, is that each stage needs to be approved and the deliverables approved. So the diagrams will show of each stage will show the stages on the top, and then what the deliverables are for that particular stage, and then what that gate is, the gate then that requires to be approved to go on to the next stage. The diagrams may be a bit difficult to read in this slideshow, but when you read the actual manual, you should find them very helpful. So we'll go into this flowchart in more detail in the webinar in the coming slides. I'd like to point out that apart from the colors being the CESA branding, the gray colored stages relate to the design and procurement stages of the process, and the light blue colored stages relate to the works, handover, and closeout stages. And this pattern you'll see in a number of the following slides as well. So I'd like now to hand over to Craig, who will talk to us about the infrastructure life cycle.
Thank you, Francis, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to just start the process of looking at a typical project, and to look at the project and to say that one must not just think about a project, an infrastructure project, as simply being a quick design process and then construction and that's it. There's far more to a project than just the design and construction. Any project starts with the initiation, the identification of the project, and you then go through a whole process of developing the concept design, the detailed design. You eventually go through the procurement of contractors. You hand the project over to your client, and the client then goes through the operations and maintenance of the project, the operating phase of the project when it's in use, and eventually you get to the point where it's reached the end of its useful life, and you either renew the project, you rebuild it, or you dispose, you demolish it and start all over again. So a project is not just a start and a finish, it's really a never-ending cycle of renewal over and over. And so the point I'm really trying to make is that when you embark on a project, you mustn't just think about the cost of the design or the cost of the construction. You actually need to think about the total life cycle cost. And if we look at this little diagram that's appeared, you can see there, and this is based on many surveys around the world, in fact, the cost of professional services on a typical infrastructure project or any building project, it forms about 1 to 2% of the total cost. The cost of construction is about 13% of the total cost, whereas the cost of actually operating and maintaining that piece of infrastructure forms 85% of the total cost. So having said that, it seems rather short-sighted to go and employ the cheapest consulting engineer to look after 99% of your investment in a project. Or if you want to look at it from another way, it makes a lot more sense to employ to spend a little bit more money on making sure that you employ the consulting engineer or the professional services provider who's best going to be able to look after your interests and to give you a project that will have the lowest overall life cycle costs. And that actually, ladies and gentlemen, is the fundamental objective of this procurement of consulting engineering services manual, is to assist you, or to assist those of our clients that are here, to ensure that you are able to procure the services of the best consulting engineer for your infrastructure project. Moving on from that, what we see here is just a little interesting curve, and it's really just a reminder that forward planning or master planning is extremely important when you embark on any project, in fact, and particularly an infrastructure project. Why? Because any decisions that are made very early in the project cycle can be made with very little cost. If you look at the black line, that gives you the cost of implementing a change. The cost of making a decision at the beginning of the project is virtually nothing. Whereas as you go on through the project, the cost, sorry, I said the black line, it's actually the white line, is the cost of implementing a project change. Is the white line is low at the beginning of the project, and it becomes increasingly high. Whereas the ability to actually influence the overall cost is shown in the black line, and that reduces as the project goes on. And that actually is what causes or results in the success or failure of many projects. And sadly, I think based on what we see in the media, it would seem that some of the problems that we see at projects like Medupi and Kusile could be attributed to poor early planning or perhaps a lack of proper master planning. So it's extremely important that you employ the best possible consulting engineering company as early in your project cycle as you possibly can to make a success of it. And again, I repeat that we hope that this Procurement of Consulting Engineering Services manual will assist you in that process. Francis, thank you. Yeah, now the purpose of this slide is just to show you that in that overall project cycle, typically and traditionally, the consulting engineer has a role to play in portion of that, and that is what this slide illustrates, and it follows the IDMS stages of a typical project. So the consulting engineer's role should start as early as possible at project initiation stage, when you start defining the project parameters, developing the brief of the project and the terms of reference. The consulting engineer will then take you on through the concept design stage, where you develop the preliminary contract design stages and determine the financial feasibility of the project. Your consulting engineer will take you through the development of the detailed design, the documentation of the project, putting it out to tender, procuring construction contractors, and the consulting engineer will then help you through the process of construction by monitoring the works. It will get to the point of commissioning and completing the project, handing it over to the client for operation and maintenance. And then the consulting engineers also stays with you as part of your project through the defects liability stage and completes all the contractual formalities, the final accounts, the payments, and so on. So that just shows you the typical stages of a typical project and the role that the consulting engineer can play during those stages. I'll hand you back to Francis at this point.
Thank you, Craig. We'll now go into the legal environment surrounding procurement of consulting engineers especially. And of course, start with the section 217 of the Constitution. This requires that organs of state must implement procurement using fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective processes. They may also implement a procurement policy providing for categories of preference in the allocation of contracts and the protection or advancement of persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. Thirdly, national legislation must prescribe a framework within which the policy referred to in subsection 2 must be implemented, and hence we have the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act. I'm just going to go through these elements: fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective in a bit more detail. What do they mean in terms of procurement? So fairness means the process of offer and acceptance is conducted impartially, without bias, and provides participating parties simultaneous and timely access to the same information. Terms and conditions for performing the work do not unfairly prejudice the interests of the parties, barring, of course, their ability to do the work. Equitable means that people are treated equally, and so the only grounds for not awarding a contract to a tenderer who complies with all the responsiveness and functionality requirements are that there might be restrictions from doing business with the organization identified during a risk assessment. For example, a lack of capability or capacity. Perhaps they have won other work since putting in the tender and they no longer have the capability, or as Dave mentioned, the CVs aren't available, or there are legal impediments, or there are conflicts of interest. Transparency, so the procurement process and criteria upon which decisions are to be made must be published. Decisions are made publicly available together with reasons for those decisions. It is possible to verify the criteria that were applied in the evaluation, and the requirements of procurement documents are presented in a clear, unambiguous, comprehensive, and understandable manner. And lastly, well, not lastly, the process must be competitive. And so the system provides for appropriate levels of competition to ensure cost-effective and best value outcomes. And this is finally, the processes, procedures, and methods are standardized with sufficient flexibility to attain best value outcomes in respect of quality, timing, and price, and the least resources to effectively manage and control the procurement process. Then there's the question of the promotion of other objectives. In terms of the triple PFA, an organ of state must determine its preferential procurement policy and implement it. A preference point system must be followed, and the specific goals may include contracting with persons or categories of persons historically disadvantaged by unfair discrimination on the basis of race, gender, or disability. And any specific goal for which a point may be awarded must be clearly specified in the invitation to submit a tender. Now, this is all great, but as long as it's not at the expense of service delivery. Okay, the next slide, this slide shows that in addition to the Constitution, there are another 11 acts of Parliament, many of with their own regulations, which impact on the procurement of consulting engineering services. And as well as that, there are guidelines, practice notes, and instructions that have been issued by our National Treasury. So, as you all know, the aim of the Public Procurement Bill that is in preparation is to simplify this all, and which we sincerely hope will be achieved, but unlikely to be until after the elections, we expect. So this next slide shows the procurement practice in South Africa, how it used to be. National Treasury's practice note of 2003, Supply Chain Management Practice Note 3, set out the procedures to be followed for selecting, contracting, and monitoring consultants required for projects. And this was based on quality and cost-based selection, which was the recommended process, quality-based selection, selection under a fixed budget, least cost selection, and single source selection. So in the document, we go through what when these are useful, when they are applied. And I think there's quite a lot of favor with quality cost-based selection, and the way it was being applied after this Treasury note was that instead of the 90-10 being just price and preference, the 90 had a proportion of quality in there or functionality in there. So you could have a 70-20 split between price and functionality, or vice versa. And so these approaches were used until in a judgment received in the KZN High Court in 2009, when the ruling was between a conflict between Regulation 8 of the preferential procurement, which allowed the 80 or 90 points to be equal for, or to cover both price and quality, and the prescripts of the Act, which allows for 80 or 90 points for price only. So there wasn't any functionality aspect to that score, and of course the Act stood. And so since then, the use of the quality cost-based selection and quality-based selection methods are thus no longer permitted in South Africa. So what have we got now? We've got two systems. Well, the first is just the 80-20, 90-10 being the price preference, which was covered in National Treasury's instruction note of September 2010. And what they require now is that the assessment of functionality is done, and a bid must be is done first, and a bid must be disqualified if it fails to meet the minimum threshold of functionality as per the bid invitation. And thereafter, only the qualifying bids are evaluated in terms of the 80-20 or 90-10 price preference system. So I think we all agree that this has had a negative impact on public infrastructure projects without careful drafting of the functionality criteria and then a proper evaluation of the proposals received. A lot of proposals get through the functionality gate, which possibly should not have. We will therefore go into some detail in the PCES manual on the drafting and evaluation of functionality criteria. So the second procurement method is by panel appointments, and we're seeing this happening more and more because it obviously simplifies the tendering process. And they're commonly used where a client has a number of projects to be delivered in an ensuing period, usually 3 financial years, but the scope of services and scope of work for each of the projects has not yet been clearly defined. Tenderers are invited for the appointment of a panel of consultants for the provision of professional engineering services for the period concerned, and evaluation is done first on functionality, and then there might be a price preference points evaluation done on the basis of a percentage fee for a sample project with a construction value that's given by the client. So, and there's quite sophisticated panel systems going. We understand the Western Cape Department of Transport and Public Works has introduced an online consultant register system that operates on this basis, And but the whole procurement process and often the success of the project is dependent on the formulation of project appropriate functionality criteria and the objective evaluation of tenders received. And this brings the whole question of integrity and procurement processes and CESA standpoint on this. And Craig will be talking to this on the next slide.
Thank you, Francis. Yeah, I just think it's very important for us to understand that CESA takes integrity management extremely seriously, and I think that is one of the points that we try to make in the procurement manual, is that if you appoint a consulting engineer who is a member of CESA, you can be assured that that firm is obliged to abide by CESA's integrity management principles. And just be aware that obviously in terms of the Engineering Council, EXA Code of Conduct, individual professionally registered persons have to abide by that Code of Conduct, and they're subject to EXA's disciplinary procedures if they transgress it. Whereas in the case of the CESA Code of Conduct, the CESA member firms are required to abide by the CESA Code of Conduct. And it's important to also understand that CESA member firms every year are required to sign a statement of commitment to business integrity, which is obviously aimed purely at ensuring professional services free of corruption of any nature. And just again for information, where there is an alleged transgression of the CESA Code of Conduct, CESA has a very clearly laid out disciplinary procedure whereby anybody, whether it's a client or just a member of the public or another consulting engineer, can report and lay a complaint against such a member firm with CESA. Obviously, the complaint has to be properly formulated. It then goes through a really rigorous disciplinary process where the complaint is examined in great detail to establish the merits of the situation. And if a CESA member firm is found to have transgressed CESA's code of conduct, they are sanctions do apply. They are sanctioned, and the sanctions may include a simple reprimand or a suspension or expulsion or even a fine. So just to reiterate, one of the advantages of employing the services of a CESA member firm are that you have that fallback of knowing that those members are subject to a very strictly applied code of conduct. Thank you. I think it's back to Francis now.
Thank you, Craig. So I'm back with this slide, which is the one I showed you at the beginning. And it's showing the IDMS flowchart. And so as I mentioned, it's got the 7 stages, and Craig has also spoken to the consulting engineer's role in each of those. And in the blue blocks below the stages, it's got what the deliverables are in that stage that require approval. But and you'll see a lot of similarity here with the EXA stages, and Craig is just going to briefly touch on the differences between the two.
Yeah, this is quite an important slide because I'm sure everybody is familiar with the Engineering Council of South Africa Scope of Services guideline, which they publish annually, and it usually or very, very often forms the basis of the scope of services to be provided by a consulting engineer. It's usually referred to in most client consulting engineer agreements. And when we look at the project as we've done in this PCES manual, and we've based the stages of the projects on following the IDMS project stages, you will find that there are a few small differences when you compare that with the stages that are set out in the EXA document. To start with, and I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail, the project initiation stage in the IDMS framework assumes that the first stage, initiation, includes the feasibility study as well as the project inception stage that we understand for project inception in the EXA document, whereas the EXA document separates or does not include the feasibility study in the normal stages of a project. And if I can just illustrate this by describing a simple example of a project, and let's assume that as a client, you've identified the need to develop a wastewater treatment works. Now, most informed clients, and obviously many clients are very informed, and those clients would have the in-house capacity and capability of undertaking the initial project feasibility study themselves, and they'll be able to develop the project terms of reference and the project budget, and even a draft program for the project rollout, and to use this to enable them to procure the services of a consulting engineer to take the project through the detailed design and construction. But then many other clients don't have that capacity, and they are unable to define and describe the project in sufficient detail to enable the appointment of a consulting engineer. So it's just very important in those circumstances that clients who do not have the capacity to do the feasibility study themselves should appoint a separate consulting engineer to undertake that stage for them. And that is how the CESA document assumes it to be, that the feasibility study has already been done, and that you hand over to your consulting engineer who will take it through inception, concept viability, and so on until the closeout stages. And then the only other material difference between the IDMS stages and the CESA document, the CESA stages, is that in the IDMS document, or sorry, I'm going to say in the CESA document, the guidelines assume that stage 5 includes the project construction stage and completion of the project construction to the point of handover, whereas in the IDMS stages, the handover of a completed project is identified as a separate stage 6 on its own. And then stage 6 and in the CESA documents and stage 7 in the IDMS project stages are essentially identical. So it's just important to understand those slight differences, and these are described in the PCES manual. Thank you. And I think it's over to Dave at this point. No, it's over to Francis, sorry.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, this rather busy slide, and don't worry, we're not going to go through all of these little balloons, is now specific for the procurement of professional services. It's based on National Treasury's FIDPM instruction, and also the training module published by MESA, few municipalities who participated. And it has been adapted when necessary specifically to the procurement of consulting engineering services rather than the procurement of contractors. So PG1 to PG7, these procurement gates, we now refer to them as procurement gates, each require that certain prescripts are met and formal approval given by the delegated person or agent of the client before the next procurement stage is commenced. So we'll discuss these stages separately in the coming slides, but just a note is that although we showed the IDMS covering the whole infrastructure cycle or the whole project cycle, these now you might be procuring consulting engineering services for one or two or more stages of the IDMS stage. So there's not a direct link necessarily between the procurement gates and the gates of the IDMS. And we'll talk to that a bit more also in the coming slide. And that is where Dave comes in now.
Thank you, Francis. So it's common practice that consultants may be appointed all the way from stages 1 to 7, but this is not always the case. For instance, in the case of a proposed housing development, the developer might be interested in buying a piece of land, and he will employ a consulting engineer to do the concept, to work out the cost of construction, cost and availability of services, rentals, sales predictions, municipal restrictions and bylaws. And at the end of this concept, it might be quite a long time before the development actually goes ahead. And in that case, another consultant might be appointed to carry on with the rest of the development. Some projects don't go to construction. For instance, the water service development plans, stormwater, roads and stormwater master plans. But as I said, it's good practice to try and get continuity. But sometimes consultants are appointed on a 3-year term contract and only get to detail design in the 3-year, necessitating the appointment of another consultant to do the contract supervision. This has its own complexities. So the new consultant may have to issue a variation order and thereby alters the design of the previous consultant. So now who carries the design risk? Is it necessary now to do a design review? So appointing term contractors, you have to be aware that you could be faced with a future problem. In terms of limiting a consultant's involvement in downstream work, this has been challenged in court and there's no limitation. We think it's the consultant has done the feasibility, is actually best placed to do the downstream work rather than start from scratch. And in terms of the conflict of interest in evaluating construction tenders, we believe this is a misguided concern. There may be qualifications in the tender which will change the design. And so therefore, I think the guys that have actually drawn up the tender document should evaluate the tender. If you are worried about conflict of interest, Francis already talked and Craig about the CESA and the CESA codes of conduct. So if you have a CESA member doing that, your risk is really limited. So I actually think consulting engineers, a professional engineer, is invaluable in evaluating tenders. And then I think I need to hand over to Francis again.
Thank you, Dave. So I'm going to take you through a few of the first steps of the procurement process. So this is the initiate procurement process, and essentially the client, the person who's the project manager, perhaps for the client, needs to establish the need, prepare a project description, a broad scope of works, estimate the financial value that's of the project, and confirm that budget's available. And how does he do this? How does he get that information? Well, there are different sources depending on what stage of the project you're in. And for example, I've just shown it here for the cost of infrastructure, but it applies for all of these requirements. In stage 1, you can get the estimated price or the description of the project from a master plan or an RDP, so stage 1 initiation. Or if you're in stage 2 concept, you can use the estimated cost of the project from stage 1 or from a pre-feasibility report. And similarly, if you're in stage 3, or if the appointment is for stage 3, you will have completed stage 2, and you will have that information available to compile these requirements for this stage. So for this procurement gate, shall I say, sorry if I'm confusing stages and procurement gate. Stages we're referring to the IDMS stage, and procurement gates referring to the procurement process. So the next one is, next gate rather, is developing the procurement strategy. And just as a starting point, we must point out that this manual only deals with the contracting strategy designed by client and the associated procurement of consulting engineering services. Under this strategy, a contractor is appointed to construct the works, and a consulting engineer is appointed to provide the design services on behalf of the client, as well as the contract administration and closeout services during the construction stage. So what are the commonly used procurement strategy? They might be, and it's also to deal with, are you going out on a single envelope system where the functionality, technical and financial proposals are provided together in a single envelope? Or are you going for a two-stage system where you might have the financial proposal in a separate envelope that's only opened once the evaluation of the functionality and responsiveness has been done? And on larger projects, you can have a two-stage bidding process. Where in the first stage, bidders are invited to pre-qualify on the basis of their experience on similar projects and the strength of the team they are able to allocate to the project. And then a short list is developed. And in the second stage, competitive bids are invited from the pre-qualified tenderers using a one or two envelope system. The other options for contracting strategy are with respect to multidisciplinary consulting engineering services, where how do you approach that? Do you appoint a single multidisciplinary consultant, or appoint a principal consultant who is responsible for appointing sub-consultants who are discipline specific? Or do you require a joint venture of consultants with expertise in the various disciplines? And in that regard, CESA has recently published a model joint venture agreement for use in these instances. Or do you appoint separate consulting engineering firms in each discipline, civil, mechanical, electrical, structural, and then a project management firm to coordinate the project? With regard to the pricing strategy, and we'll talk a bit about that later. Craig will talk a bit about that later. So when do you use time-based fees? And this might be where the scope of the service cannot be determined and or defined before commencement of the project, or where it's specialist engineering work of perhaps an undefined scope, or on small projects, and sometimes for feasibility studies or investigations and reports, including forensic engineering work. You might want to do it on a time basis. Dispute resolution involving arbitration, and all matters relating to provision of advice as an expert witness, and other things, other investigations such as surveys, audits, studies, assessments, all involving the provision of engineering advice. So it's similar to if you look at EXA's additional services list. It's basically a lot of the time you might want to appoint someone on a time basis when the scope is on the additional services list of EXA. Percentage-based fees are obviously a simple, fair means of remuneration. They remain the most popular method of calculating the fee in South Africa. The fee is self-adjusting as the project circumstances and cost of works varies. And of course, a percentage-based fee relies heavily on the integrity of the consulting engineer to design cost effectively, so as not to unnecessarily inflate the cost of the works. But again, you're dealing with CESA members here who are governed by these integrity policies. But it might represent a poor remuneration system when the cost of the works is unusually low for any reason. And then the last pricing strategy you might adopt is lump sum, which can only be applied where the project brief, scope of work, and scope of service are all accurately described in the terms of reference. So that's basically a description of these processes. And you also need to decide on your preferential procurement aspects, which will of course be according to the preferential procurement policy of the client, and decide on the form of contract. And there's an approved list, but generally the PCES manual has been based on the CESA model form of agreement, and which has recently been issued again, the 2022 version. And but there are the others like the FIDIC or the NEC 3 or 4 that can be used. Okay, I'll go on to the next gate, which is to prepare the procurement documents. So this slide shows basically the that you need to have the tender section, the functionality criteria, and the contract section. And I'm not going to go into it in any more detail because Craig is going to spend a couple of slides talking to this. So over to you, Craig.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, I think as all our listeners can see, there's an awful lot of information in the PCES manual, and we've dealt with a lot of principles up to date. There's also a lot of guidance provided to assist a client to actually put together a procurement document specifically for appointing a consulting engineer. Now, just in very broad principle, the structure of the document would be basically the same as you're familiar with. It's got a tender section and a contractual section. The tender section would have the tender notice, the tendering procedures, and all the returnable documents, while the contractual section would have the form of offer and acceptance, the contract data, the pricing data, and the terms of reference. So in other words, it's basically a standard procurement document structure, same as you use for construction of contractors. It's very similar for professional services providers, specifically consulting engineers, but the document, the way you put the document together in detail is very specific for procuring consulting engineering services. And now we come to the next section of the PCES manual, or part 2 of the manual, where we've actually put together a pro forma request for proposal document to assist clients. And it's intended to help you when you're preparing a tender document for the procurement of consulting engineering services. It is modeled on the CIDB standard for uniformity. Okay, it's based on the August 2019, which is the latest current version, and on SANS 10845. But the 2019 version of the standard for uniformity does not make provision for professional services. And it was for this reason that we've really gone into a lot of detail to assist any client who wants to procure consulting engineering services to make it easier for them. So as Francis mentioned a few minutes ago, the pro forma that we've produced uses the CESA Model Professional Services Agreement as the standard form of contract, but there's no reason why you shouldn't use any other recognized standard form of professional services agreement as for the form of agreement. Just please remember, we try to produce something that could be as widely used as possible, but obviously we couldn't cover every possible situation. So it's really for smaller or medium-sized projects which are not too complex, and generally where only the appointment involves a single consulting engineering firm. So one wouldn't expect the pro forma to be just go and used blindly where you've got a complex multidisciplinary project. Okay, obviously you must make care in using the pro forma document to ensure that it complies with your own client supply chain management policy and obviously all relevant legislation. What we've done, and I'll go into this a little bit more detail on the next page, on the next slide, sorry, we've put in notes to assist you. Just for information, there at the bottom of the slide, the pro forma template, Wally explained this at the beginning of the program. It's obtainable free of charge in electronic format as either PDF or MS Word on request to general@cesa.co.za. I'm sure that'll be on the slide. So if you could just move on to the next slide, please, Francis. Because what we've done here is the pro forma is a complete document, but we've just extracted one page just to illustrate to you what it does. So this is just one random page out of the pro forma document, and you'll see there that it is, those of you that are familiar with the typical procurement document will recognize this comes out of the specific contract data section, data provided by the client. And there you have a compiler note, which is highlighted, and it's highlighted to explain to you that it is a compiler note. When you've read it, when you've applied it, you delete that. Then the next section really helps you. It's almost like paint by numbers, where you simply fill in all the information. And again, the highlighted sections explain exactly what you've got to fill in and how to do it. So that is how the entire procurement document is put together. I believe it really will assist any client to procure the services of a consulting engineer, but of course it must be used with care. We really could spend a couple of hours going through this document in detail. All we're doing here is making you aware of the availability of the pro forma, which, as I said, you can obtain from CESA free of charge. Thank you. If you can carry on, that we're now over to Dave. Dave's going to talk to you about functionality criteria. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. As Craig was saying, paint by numbers, but when it comes to functionality criteria, you need to apply your mind. This is the only place where, in our current procurement legislation, where the client can specify the capability and experience of the consultants whose bids will be evaluated on price and preference. Those tenderers who fail functionality must be excluded. The criteria must be drawn up in such a way that excludes the possibility that subjectiveness can affect the outcome of the functionality evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have in the Proforma given quite a few examples of how to put together a functionality scoring. This one is for staff. So one can specify what skills and experience of staff you would like on the project, depending on the complexity of the project. Now, this is known as the CV game, as the consultant will put forward names to get through functionality. But these staff are in every tender. And should the consultant be busy on more than one project, it will be necessary to clone him. So at least in specifying your requirements, you can demand equal or better experience people on your project. Next slide, please. Thank you. Approach and methodology. Reviewing the methodology proposed is key on complex projects where the clients need to have comfort that the consultant understands the needs of the client. And you can be quite specific here. You could say, I want an engineer or a firm that has done 20 megaliter reservoirs or pump stations that have pumped 30 liters a second, and be quite specific. So to ensure that you get a consulting company that is capable of addressing your needs. Think on to Craig.
Thanks, Dave. Francis actually covered a lot of this in a slide a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but when you setting out the pricing data in your procurement document for consulting services, and I must admit we have to keep reminding ourselves we're not talking about a procurement document for construction, we're talking about a procurement document for consulting engineering services specifically. So First of all, it is suggested that you follow best practice principles as laid down by CESA in the CESA guideline that is published annually. And on that basis, obviously, your scope of services and remuneration should follow the CESA guideline scope of services and tariff of fees. And you can actually refer to that when you develop and put your procurement document together. As Francis mentioned, the fee can be either percentage-based, lump sum, or time-based, and each one has advantages and disadvantages, and you need to apply that according to your particular project. Percentage-based fees are, in my opinion, the most simple. They're familiar to everybody. They're most used in South Africa. They self-adjusting, which means that if the project value changes, the fee percentage compensates the client and the consulting engineer accordingly, because the fee gets adjusted. So it's really simple and straightforward, but it actually is not always appropriate. Quite often used now are lump sum fees, which is nice and easy for the client. The client knows exactly the sum of money involved, or it can be time-based, and time-based fees are really important when the scope of the service is not well defined, particularly on things like feasibility studies or reports or so on. Your fee would normally be time-based. And this is actually explained in the PCES manual in more detail, and it's also described in the pro forma document. Just a reminder that by their very nature, professional fees are generally remeasurable. They really have to be, because the construction contract is not sufficiently known at the time of procurement of the professional services provider, and therefore it needs to be a remeasurable fee. Normally, as I've already said, percentage fees are applied for normal services, whereas for additional services, in other words, services not included in the normal services, such as studies or site surveys or geotech surveys, etc., those would be time-based. Construction monitoring is normally time-based, and of course, reports and investigations. And then don't forget that expenses and costs must be reimbursed. And once again, this is explained, and assistance is provided in the pro forma on how to achieve this. And then it's suggested that you allow provisional sums for additional services where you don't know the detail of what's required at the time when you're procuring services of the consulting engineer. You allow provisional sums in the pricing data for the document. Thank you. Dave, I think it's over to you.
It's over to me. Thanks.
Back to you. Sorry, Francis.
Yeah.
Leaving you out.
I'll just talk to these two slides and then hand over to Dave. So these are now internal processes in the client. We finished the procurement document. It's been approved, and the next step is to confirm the cash flow or confirm the financial arrangements. So confirming that there's sufficient budget to cover the contractual commitments. This is a key action in the procurement in the procurement process. Where the contract is likely to extend over more than one financial year, budgetary provisions will be required over the medium-term expenditure framework. For large and mega projects which extend beyond the medium-term expenditure framework, future funding requirements must be provided in the submissions to Treasury in terms of Section 33 of the MFMA. Also, the full annual and operating and maintenance costs, as well as in monitoring and evaluation costs over the lifetime of the asset, need to be included in submissions. Then control measures. The accounting officer must ensure that there are control measures in place for payment of the consultant within the time period provided for in the contract. Should these control measures not be in place and payments are delayed beyond the time period provided for in the contract, the client may become liable for interest claims. And the invoices for interest will go straight to the municipal finance manager and are dealt with in the municipal audit. So that is a way to draw attention when you're not being paid, is to submit an interest claim, interest invoice. Okay, so now we've got the money and we can go out and get the tenders. Tenders office should be invited in accordance with the supply chain management policy. So whether you're getting quotations because the sum is less than 200,000, or whether you're going out for public tender or you're inviting from your panel, these things will be defined in the supply chain management policy. Then you would hold a tender briefing session, which would normally be held for infrastructure projects or being solicited, except in the case of small or simple projects. It's sometimes practical to hold online briefings, and I think COVID has done that for us, that it's made us all accustomed to attending online briefings, although I see now the preference for many clients is to go back to on-site or in the office briefings, and this has led to some problems where 500 people have arrived for a briefing. A decision needs to be taken also whether the briefing is compulsory or non-compulsory. If the briefing is not compulsory, a registration system for all tenderers must be established so that addenda to the tender documents can be sent to all who have registered. Then you need to receive the tenders. They need to be recorded and safeguarded. And Procurement Gate 5 is complete when the delegated personal body ensures that all received offers are duly accounted for. And I'm now going to pass to Dave, who's going to talk about Procurement Gate 6, which is the evaluation of tenders.
Okay, thank you. I think this is where a lot of our clients come unstuck, or even private companies come unstuck in evaluating tenders. So you open and record them, check tenders are complete, check tenders are responsive, evaluate tenders, perform risk analysis, and prepare tender evaluation report. And now in the following slides, I will go through each of these. But the one that is always missed is performing the risk analysis. And that's where a lot of problems come in, that we don't take the trouble. We get a tender document, we don't evaluate it properly, we don't look for the risks. And I'll cover some of those in the next slide. You can go to the next one. So in terms of completeness, it needs to be signed, all of those standard things. We normally, in your tender data, it tells you what needs to be done to be complete and what needs to be done to be responsive. Now, responsiveness is critical. Now, I'm going to use an example from a construction contract where if there's a mechanical equipment component in a tender, we normally have a section in the tender which the tenderer must fill in the mechanical data sheets. If these are not filled in, you have no way of comparing it with another tenderer. So you've got to make sure that if you are going to check responsiveness, you've got to be strict on it, because you could end up with a tender that is not a true reflection of what you need. Then in terms of functionality, we find that this is also a process where it can be badly flawed. We've picked up a case recently where there were very basic extension errors, whether deliberate or unintentional, we don't know, but it had serious consequences when it was awarded to that particular tenderer. I've seen haphazard tender evaluations done. One occasion, I spoke to the supply chain manager and asked him, how on earth did this person get appointed? And he said, well, because I looked at his returnable schedules, I did a score and he failed functionality. And the supply chain manager said, they all failed, therefore they all passed. So please avoid that kind of thing. Another occasion, the functionality was maybe too strict and everyone failed. So then the client started to relax functionality criteria. Now that I believe is illegal, but he kept on doing it until he had enough qualifying tenders. So don't set your functionality too stiffly. And for instance, I saw a question popping up now about the length of what happens if a consultant doesn't complete on time. Well, I don't think anyone completes on time these days. So if you set functionality that he must complete all his projects on time before, and then we'll give him functionality points, you're going to fail everyone. So just think carefully about your functionality criteria. Now I'll get into risk analysis. And this is where one has to be very careful. You might find that more than one, there are tenders that have the same shareholders or boards of directors as another. So it's entrepreneurial, where they were just putting in bids using different company structures. And you got to go through very carefully to make sure that you're not dealing with entrepreneurs that are intending to subcontract everything out. And Google is a very good way to find out if there are any reasons why you should not award a contract. For instance, you might find they have concurrent court cases. They're in financial difficulty. So Google is your friend and you need to use it. So I'm going to repeat what we said earlier. I would recommend that you have a professional engineer reviewing the tender, doing the tender evaluation, because inexperienced staff will miss important things and that'll have drastic consequences. If you can go to the next slide, please. Nowadays, awarding contracts is taking far too long. So you notify all the tenderers, allow an objection period, compile contract document, formally accept tender offer. Unfortunately, the gap between the last two is enormous and things can change in that time. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 6 months, but consultants might go under, or they might get too much work. Their staff will leave, because I notice in Johannesburg, there's a huge turnover of staff, unlike other centers like Durban and Cape Town and East London. So if you take too long, the people that you hope to have in your consulting firm have gone. So please try not to drag the process out. The supply chain management must set dates and they must meet those dates. Otherwise, you're making nonsense of the whole process. The escalation is not taken into account quite often, and the fee becomes now too low for the work that's got to be done. We could move on, please. Administrating the contract. You award the contract, administer the contract, ensure compliance with the contract, and complete the contract and close out. So I find that administering the contract is not always appreciated by the clients. They have their own rules and regulations. For instance, recently I saw a client saying that he's not going to allow compensation events. Well, in this case, it wasn't even a NEC contract, was actually a JBCC, so it's actually a variation order. But you can't unilaterally decide you're not going to abide by the contract that you have signed with your consultant. So please the contract rules, and it must be applied fairly to both parties. Next slide, please. Okay, now at the end of the document, we have the Appendix A, which lists all the engineering disciplines, and there are many of them, and we've been through these, making sure everyone is considered and listed. The panel appointments in Appendix B and framework agreements, you can read that, it's good reading. Wally and Craig and Francis are very good at researching, so you'll be sure that a lot of stuff is in there that you would find useful. Appendix C is examples of international best practices, procurement of consulting engineering services, and unfortunately, we stuck with our particular system, which doesn't take quality into account, and that's really counts against the profession and against the clients. Appendix D is useful websites, and Appendix E is a consulting engineering performance scorecard, and I saw some questions popping up about that, so maybe you can look at Appendix E and get some guidance on that. Thank you from my side. Back to Wally.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to the panel. At this point, friends of CESA, we've come to the start of the quality and answer section of the webinar, and I'd like to pose the questions submitted by the delegates. I'd just like to say that we've got, hundreds of questions. We've got a lot of questions, and I'd really like to ask your permission to continue a little bit over the scheduled time as we can answer, so we can answer the questions. And then if people have to leave, then if they would just quietly drop off the webinar. But people have taken the time to ask the questions, and I think we should do our best to answer them. So I'm just going to read them out to the panel, and if the name is known, then I'll direct it. Otherwise, Francis or Craig or Dave can take ownership. So, okay, thank you. I'm just going to go to I'll start with the questions and answers and then move to the chats. A lot of people asked questions on the chat section. Okay, the first one, it's from an anonymous person. It's directed to Craig. And if the presenters can keep their answers very short, please. So Craig, since the handbook is for the procurement of consulting engineering firms, is there a direct link between the IDMS and EXA stages for fees?
Thanks, Wally. In fact, I saw that question popped up before I dealt with the slide which compared the EXA and IDMS stages. So I'm going to assume that we've already answered that. If the person could ask another question, if they want more clarification, that's fine. But in the interest of time, I'm assuming we've answered that one.
Thank you very much, Craig. Then I'm not sure to whom or who will answer this one. It's also anonymous. Please elaborate on the court case that removed the quality criteria. I presume they're
Perhaps
referring
Wally, I can answer that one. So it is mentioned in the document. It was in fact brought by a contractor who objected to having functionality being the scoring included in the scoring for price. And then there was a second case in the Eastern Cape. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it in the document itself. I have got the number in the presentation as well, but it is in the document. And if you give me I think carry on with the next question, and then I'll find it. Yes. and come back to it.
Okay. So the next question is from someone by the name of Rahel. It says, regarding the appointment of service providers for different stages, if we have a design done previously as per stage 2, can say the consultants appointed from stage 3 will take over the responsibility on the designs done previously? And therefore, do they need to assess the work done stage 2 and make it match to its own standards? Can we, however, make the previous consultant in the validity and accuracy of the feasibility studies and specialist studies, since stage 3 design is based on a previous study? So I think that relates to the responsibilities of subsequent appointed consultants. I'm not sure who'd like to answer that one.
Let me talk to that. Yeah, it's a very, very risky business taking on someone else's design. And the person taking on at stage 3 or a later stage must evaluate the risk. And it's the consultant's own risk. He needs to decide, is he going to take the responsibility? The problem lies with the professional liability. And I don't know how, I'm not an expert on that, because if the next consultant is amending the design, I think the first consultant is then off the hook. So anyone of the panel want to comment on that?
I can just, sorry.
Go on, Craig.
I was just going to say, yeah, you're quite right. It's a really complex subject. I think CESA has produced a couple of practice notes on the subject. It would take us a long time to go into it properly, but the bottom line is that there is the risk taking by both the initial consultant and the second consultant. And from the client's point of view, this is one of the reasons that I think we as the 3 panelists do not recommend appointing multiple consultants for different stages, because the result has to be that the second consulting engineer will have to check the work of the first consulting engineer. That costs money, and those costs are going to be passed on to the client. So yeah, it's a complex subject. I don't think we can address it properly in this forum.
Wally, perhaps I can just also share my insight there. That yeah, I think you can do it, but then you must make the second consultant, the one who's appointed for stage 3, he's responsible for the design. So he then takes on the full liability, because obviously there's no liability for someone who's done a concept design if someone else, if the later consultant is doing the detailed design. The detailed design is what is going to be judged. But however, you know, if the first consultant has done feasibility studies, for example, they might have done geotechnical investigations or something that is relied upon in the detailed design, you can still hold the first consultant liable for those things if there are mistakes in it. Yeah. So there are aspects of the work of the earlier stage consultant that you can hold them responsible for.
Okay, thank you all 3 that answered. That was a great answer and a good question. Next question is from T. Machale. Will the recording be made available, and does the webinar carry CPD points? And the answer to both those questions is in the affirmative. The recording will be made available, and the webinar does carry CPD points. Next question is from Walter Morane from MISA. Does the CESA template assist in aligning the tender document preparation to the chosen tender and contract conditions?
I think I'll answer that one. If I understand the question correctly, as we said, the pro forma is based on using the CESA model form of agreement as the chosen contract conditions. If you choose a different one, you're going to have to adjust the contract data to suit. That is the main thing. It can be done, but you then have to adjust the contract data.
Thank you, Craig. Then I see Walter's asked another 2 questions. So if someone can deal with them quickly, we can accommodate him. It says, when you appoint a contractor, do you do it through the consultant or directly?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's always directly, because otherwise the consultant becomes like the principal agent for the construction project, which is not, we want to allocate the risks to the contractor. So the contract must be between the employer and the contractor, and the consultant can be the employer's agent under the GCC. Yeah.
And then the next question, I'm sorry to be brief. Thank you. The next question is for Dave. I think it says, also from Walter, evaluation. Is it possible to reject a tender if it is risky? More on the reasonableness of the tender offer. In other words, whether it's a reasonable offer, but it's risky, can you reject it?
Of course, you may reject it, and that's the problem, is people don't reject them because they don't evaluate the risk. The reason why, for instance, we always ask for financials, 3 years of financials. Everyone needs to supply that. So if you get a tender you've got a 50 million rand tender in 6 months, and you look at the contractor's financials, and his turnover in the last year was 20 million. How on earth is he going to do a 50 million project in 6 months? So you must apply your mind. It's too risky. And we have a case right like that at the moment, and the contractor is unable to do the work, and it can happen with a consultant as well. So risk analysis, the reason why we have it is that we need to throw out tenders that are too risky. Otherwise, you sit with a problem.
Okay, thank you, Dave, for a good answer. Then we have a question from Berhanu Bukhali. What is the effect of using freelance or individual professional engineers in multiple consulting practice for tenders? I think they're asking if you submit a tender and you're relying on individual professional engineers using their CVs in your tenders. So they're not permanent staff. So what is that effect? And then the second part of the question is, how do you control unauthorized use of the PRNG or the CV certificates, or using with permission and not involving them?
Well, perhaps I can respond to the first one. What I understand the question is can a freelancer be in more than one tender? And sometimes clients allow it. They allow specialist sub-consultants to be in more than one bid, and sometimes they don't. So I think it's up to the preference of the client whether they want to allow that. But generally, I mean, that's for specialist sub-consultants, that's the case. But generally for freelance, it's not. I wouldn't have thought that it's acceptable.
If I could come in on the second part, it's a good idea to get the tenderers who they've submitted in their tender, the consultant, he must sign his CV and submit it. And then he's acknowledging that he's part of that bid. I think that's an important thing. I have to sign regularly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. Then Tony Cooksey has a question where he says, the risk with percentage fee structures is that the effort spent on inadequate front stage development work may cause backup delivery and quality when the final development and documentation for construction is done. Public sector clients are recently requiring man-hour plans and time cost estimates. What are the safeguards? I'm not sure who'd like to answer that.
Sorry, I'm just reading it again.
I can only say that I agree with the comment. I don't know what the safeguards are.
Okay. Just in the interest. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say is personally, I would encourage the use of man-hour plans and schedules. I think it's important.
Okay.
Makes
Thank
the
you.
consulting engineer think, but I can't comment further. Yeah.
Okay. Just in the interests of time, if we could move on. Someone anonymously asked if we can get a copy of the manual. The manual is available on the website and a link is in the chat room. Walter has come back with another question. Are the EXA guidelines competitive in the view of the Competitions Commission? It's a highly controversial topic. I don't know if anyone has a short answer to that.
I think the short answer is that we are aware that EXA and the Competition Commission are busy talking to each other and developing a memorandum of understanding. So I would say right now it's being discussed and negotiated by those two parties.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Craig. Good answer to a difficult question. The next question, the PMU, the Project Management Unit, is it cost effective to outsource project management unit to professional engineers? Is it more cost effective than to establish an internal one? The pros and cons. I don't know if it needs an in-depth answer, but maybe just a surface answer.
So our surface answers is you can't really answer without going in depth. I think it depends on it's case specific. I don't think there can be a blanket answer to that.
Okay.
I think if the PMU is lacking qualified staff, they should consider it. A lot of these municipalities don't have engineers anymore. So the PMU is often run by someone with a no technical background.
Okay. Good answer, Dave. Thank you. Moving on, Fazile Makala asks, with regard to project penalties, are we generally strict on penalties as a country? And is there a standard document with respect to cost per day? I suppose that's the penalty.
Wally, we have recently published a practice note on penalties and consulting engineering appointments.
Okay.
Which I'm not sure it answers all of these, but yes, I think there is a growing tendency towards applying penalties, and the standard cost. I would refer you to the SANROL is a good example. If you look at the SANROL tender documents, they have a typical cost per day that they would charge.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just to say to the audience that CESA practice notes are intended primarily for the use of our member firms as a membership benefit. But where clients encounter problems and queries, they're welcome to write to us and we can assist them with the practice notes. So for instance, if you have a query about penalties and you're a client, you're welcome to write to us and we can assist you. Then the next question is from Holder J. Is the CIDB standard professional services contract a recognized form of agreement?
Yes. It's still used quite widely.
Yes. And it's based on at the time that it was drafted, it was based on existing forms of agreement. So it's quite a good document, I think. Okay.
Yeah, it still appears on the CIDB website. The only problem is that it's not referred to in the 2019 SFU, but it's still there, and I agree with Wally. It's no reason why it can't be used.
Sorry, I've come to the end of the questions. I just need to go to the...
Wally, there's one other question.
Is there? Okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to read it out?
Okay, the recommendation of having a consulting engineer on the client's panel of supply chain management. Does that not act as a form of undermining the engineers employed by government that are registered by EXA? Are we saying that they are unable to perform or fulfill the obligations? And if I can leap into the answer, and that's not what we're saying at all. Obviously, if a client has professional engineers in its employ, then they are qualified to undertake the evaluations and perform the duties of the engineer in the evaluation and in drawing up the functionality criteria, etc. So and it's so we're not saying at all that you must bring in consultants if you've got professional engineers in the client body.
Okay. If I can just say at this point that we finished the Q&A questions.
There are more there, Wally.
Are there more?
Yeah.
But let's no, because that's Johnny come latelys, you know, they're adding on as we go. Let's go to the chat because they've been waiting a long time for geez, I can't get it. Sorry, I can't. No, I can't open the chat. Wait, here we are. No, I'm sorry, I can't open the chat.
You got them, Francis?
Yeah, but I mean, some of them, a lot of them are been posted on the Q&A, I think. So
Have they? Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, maybe that's a good place to end our presentation, because we were 220 attendees. We're now at 180 about, so they're starting to drop off, and we've done our best. And I think the questions have been answered very well. And there's just a few important points we'd like to make before we close. So first, of course, is to thank the presenters for availing of their time and sharing their knowledge and thoughts with us. And of course, a big thank you to you, our delegates, for supporting CESA and attending our launch webinar, the Best Practices Best Practice PCES Manual 2023. Just the points. First is we'd like you to submit any comments or suggestions you may have regarding our webinars with a view to improving them and making them more useful. And you're welcome to suggest those topics and send them to me at wally@cesa.co.za. And then the delegates are kindly requested to complete the satisfaction survey that will pop up on the screen, and then web link that will appear in the chat room. The purpose of the survey is to provide us with your satisfaction ratings or feedback that will enable us to improve our future webinars. And delegates registered with EXA may claim 0.15 CPD points for attending this webinar, and we will send you certificates. That's provided you complete the survey. And then finally, you are welcome to send me any questions that were not answered during the webinar, or if you need a web link or something else like that. And again, my email address is wally@cesa.co.za. And again, to thank you for your attendance and participation. And we hope to see you at another CESA Best Practice webinar. And of course, we wish you a good day further. Thank you.